is LBC. From Global, leading Britain's conversation, The Nigel Farage Show.
Mr. Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Donald, and good evening, everybody. Foreign aid has been a massive subject over the course of the last few years. Indeed, David Cameron, when he resigned as Prime Minister, said that one of his proudest achievements as Home Secretary was to make sure that our foreign aid budget was 0.7 of our annual GDP. That is £13 billion every year. That is £35 million every single day that we give in terms of foreign aid. And David Cameron is very, very proud of it. Some, over the course of the last few years, have criticised arbitrary limits, have made the point we spend more than any other Western country, and also have questioned where the money goes. But Hurricane Irma has brought a whole new debate to the foreign aid budget, because we know that in Caribbean islands, but British dependent territories of Turks and Caicos, Anguilla and the British Virgin Islands, devastation has been wrought in many parts of those islands, and the British government clearly wants to help territories for which we are responsible in so many ways, and they in turn, of course, are very loyal to us. But we're told that under international rules, we're not allowed to use the foreign aid budget to help these territories because their incomes apparently are too high. And I'm asking you, should we change these rules and look after our own people with the foreign aid budget? Now, to help me through the complexity of all of this and international law and my confusion as to why the British government can't give money to these islands, and yet I was in the European Parliament yesterday where the President of the European Parliament, Mr. Tajani, was talking about the fact that EU funds would be used for French and Dutch parts of the Caribbean. So I need help too. And Jonathan Foreman, who was a senior research fellow at Civitas, an author of Aiding and Abetting Foreign Aid Failures and the 0.7% Deception. I can't think of anybody better, really, to help me. Jonathan, good evening, and thank you for joining me on LBC.
Good evening, Nigel. Thank you.
Now, just let me ask you a very, very simple question, which may have a complex answer, I don't know. But why can't we spend part of our foreign aid budget on areas, British dependent territories, that have been hit by Hurricane Irma?
Well, I mean, according to the government, it's because we have to abide by rules set up by the OECD. And they say they have a list of countries you can aid, and they have to be below a certain gross national income.
Jonathan, would you just please help explain to everybody who the OECD actually are and what they do?
Well, that's actually quite a difficult thing to do. It's an international organisation set up sort of. It grew out of something called the Organisation of European Economic Development, which helped sort of organised the Marshall Plan after World War II. And then it became this sort of, it's not really a think tank, it's a big international organisation that lots of countries then send officials to, and they try and encourage development around the world. And it's in Paris, and it's full of bureaucrats, and it does some very good work, but it also has these rather arbitrary rules. And it's one of these strange things that have happened that you've talked about before as well, which is that in this country we have a tendency to sort of outsource decision-making to these foreign organisations, and it's one of them. I mean, I don't know why we made it law that the OECD should make rules for us about where we spend our aid, but we did.
Right, so we've adhered to those rules. Have we actually written it into our legislation as well?
I think we have. I mean, our own rules about where we give aid to, according to our own laws, say that our aid has to be spent outside the UK. Now, that would include the territories because they are outside the UK, even though they're British.
Yes.
So that would be all right.
Yeah, and yet, OK, so this must explain, because, as I say, I was in the European Parliament yesterday. I heard the European Parliament President say we are giving aid to the French dependent territories, St Martin's, for example, in the Caribbean, hit by Hurricane Irma. But he also said a part of St Martin's was a Dutch territory, and what they were going to do was bring in some sort of rush legislation to make sure they could get money too. So the European Union can give money to these territories, and yet the British Prime Minister says she's frustrated over Hurricane Irma relief rules. I have to say, Jonathan, I think you probably hit the nail on the head. It's a case of the British bureaucratic class saying let's dot the I and cross the T's and not being flexible. But just sort of on the bigger picture, what actually is the definition of whether a country is in need of foreign aid?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, according to the OECD, they've got to have a certain lower certain gross national income per capita, not gross domestic product, which is slightly different. And if you calculate that, the British Virgin Islands turns out to be 23,000 per person per year, whereas China, which we do aid, which is obviously a really rich country, the second biggest economy in the world, their GNI per capita is $8,000. But it doesn't really represent reality at all, obviously. I mean, it's a sort of, there are lots of poor people in those Caribbean countries.
Oh, there are. Know. I've been to the British Virgin Islands more than once, and whilst there are some international financiers earning an absolute fortune, there are lots of people living there in absolute poverty who probably, in the course of the last 10 days, have lost pretty much everything. Now, I mean, Jonathan, you have been somebody who has been deeply critical of the arbitrary limit of 0.7% per annum, and indeed, where we've spent our money and how much of it's been swallowed up in fraud and by corrupt regimes. But I'm going to ask you, do you think there is actually a case here that we should be using some of the foreign aid budget to help these Caribbean islands?
I think there's more than a case. I think it's monstrous not to. And I think if we have this money, which, as you know, sort of swishes around and at DFID and other government departments, of course it should be spent there. I mean, we also should be spending, if we have, to the extent we have an aid budget, we should be spending much more of it on emergency aid or humanitarian aid. I think most people think that's okay. It's not being spent on this vague idea of development. And at the moment, we spend, out of that 13 billion you mentioned earlier, only 600 million is spent every year on emergency aid. And yet it's the stuff that really counts. It's the stuff we're good at.
Yeah, and that's also, I think, where the hearts of taxpayers are happy to see money spent. And finally, Jonathan, our Prime Minister says she's frustrated by these rules. What, in your view, should she do?
I think they should put emergency legislation through as soon as possible. I mean, I think if she's frustrated, she should do something about it. And there are ways of it. She could also disobey the rules. I mean, that's the other thing you can do. The French do it all the time.
With everything.
You just do it.
OK. Jonathan Foreman, Senior Research Fellow at Civitas, thank you very much indeed. Well, Jonathan, they're explaining that this international organisation, the OECD, makes a set of rules about who qualifies for foreign aid, and it's based on average incomes, and the reason that the Caribbean islands, the British dependent territories of Anguilla, Turks and Caicos, and the British Virgin Islands don't qualify is average incomes are too high, because there are some very wealthy, high-earning, international, global financiers in those islands. But I've been there myself. An awful lot of poor people who will be pretty much homeless, I'm guessing, after the devastation wreaked by Hurricane Irma. So I'm asking you, should we change the rules and look after our own people? Let me know what you think by calling 0345 60 60 973. You can text to 84850. You can tweet on @LBC using the hashtag Farage and LBC. And you can, of course, watch us live on Facebook and comment there and ask questions too. And I'm going to beautiful Bude in North Cornwall to Sean, who is a first-time caller. So, Sean, what is it about the foreign aid budget that has made you pick up the phone to LBC?
Good evening, Nigel.
Good evening.
I'm an ex-forces veteran and full of compassion for humanitarian disasters globally, wherever they may be. But your last caller raised a very, very valid point, and that being that aid's decided upon the average income, if you wish, of per capita.
Yes.
Now, that's a bit cold blood. I'd like to totally simplify to two criteria. Does a country have a defence budget? Does a country have a space programme? If yes to either, then they'd certainly, it's down to that country to manage their funds in a more efficient way.
Now, I've got half a clue, Sean. I've got half a clue where you might be going with this, because equally, when I was in the front line of politics, I was very critical of this budget. I think, Sean, you might be talking about India, might you not?
I may well be, indeed. India and Pakistan and China, it's ridiculous, Nigel. It is totally, in today's modern age, particularly Today, Bank of England yet again kept our interest rates way down low.
Yes.
Our country is suffering drastically. Our nurses, doctors, fire brigade, policemen, we've got far, far better, more important local issues to worry about than supporting countries with space programs and defence.
Well, Sean, I tell you what, I'm going to have a look in more depth later on in this programme about where some of the money's gone. But let me just ask you a couple of very quick questions. Number one, do you think that these hurricane-torn places of Anguilla, Turks and Caicos and British Virgin Islands deserve some help from the mother country?
Oh, God, yes.
Absolutely.
100%. Uncategorically, yes.
And secondly, would you scrap one of Mr. Cameron's greatest achievements, the way in which he's shown the world what wonderful, compassionate and lovely people we are? Sean, would you want to scrap that target that makes the world think we're wonderful?
Yes.
Right, OK, very good. Well, Sean from Bude, thank you. First-time caller, and certainly not shy to say what he thinks. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC, and it's 7:15. Our Prime Minister says she is frustrated by international rules that prohibit her from using some of the foreign aid budget to help British dependent territories in the Caribbean, such as Anguilla, Turks and Caicos and the British Virgin Islands. But this does, I think, lead to a bigger debate about foreign aid as a whole. And let me be clear, I am deeply critical of the arbitrary limit of 0.7%. Not only do we spend more than any other country in the Western world on foreign aid, but actually we find towards the end of the financial year, if we're underspent, we have to get rid of $1 billion as quickly as we can. I think arbitrary limits are crazy. And where the money goes, goodness help me. July this year, we're having a debate about the fact that £64 million of UK taxpayers' money goes to an African country ruled by a tyrant suspected of murdering his rivals. This is Paul Kagame in Rwanda, and you've got dozens of people disappearing, being murdered, deep allegations of bribery and fraud and everything else. And it isn't just there. It goes on to many, many other countries, be it El Salvador or Sierra Leone or wherever it may be. And the ultimate joke that we've been giving money to Argentina, who've been buying jets, which they could use against us at some point in the future, and giving money to India, who have got aircraft carriers with aeroplanes on them, space programs, nuclear weapons. We've even been giving money to China. I think the whole thing is a complete and utter joke. And if this really, Mr. Cameron, is your finest achievement as the British Prime Minister, it's pretty poor. And as for us not being able to use part of this gigantic £13 billion a year budget, £35 million a day, and all the British government so far have promised is just over 50 million to help our own people in the Caribbean who've been through this rough time. I think it's pathetic. And Theresa May, if you're our Prime Minister, if you say you're frustrated by rules, don't be frustrated. The point of leadership is being able to do something. So either tear the rules up or introduce emergency legislation in Parliament early next week to make sure that we can do this. Frankly, when I hear British Prime Minister saying she's frustrated, I think it's pathetic. But if you think I'm wrong, and if you think it's ridiculous, then if you really think we should just go on giving this money to all these countries around the world, but not our own dependent territories because a few rich, high-earning people live there, then call me on 0345 60 60 973 and put me right. Patrick is calling me from Lincoln. Patrick, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. First-time caller.
First-time caller, and welcome to you. And so how do you feel about this money that could or should or perhaps should not go to these islands that have been really hurt by Hurricane Irma?
I'm baffled by the hypocrisy of it all. If we're looking at GDP per capita, we wouldn't be at the top table for the top 20. We're 27th. And saying in terms of there are rich people who live there, yes, but presumably they're serviced by very poor people who've lost everything. They've lost their jobs and their homes, and
yes.
I think they need humanitarian help. I don't even know why we had to raise it as an issue. We should just have quietly sent the money over from that sort of ring-fence budget and been quiet.
Oh, but Patrick, the Prime Minister says there are rules set down by the Paris-based bureaucracy called the Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development. I mean, Patrick, don't you respect the rules from organisations like this?
Well, people make rules. I respect rules as much as I respect people. I don't respect everybody.
So the Prime Minister, frankly, should just crack on, change the rules, and give these people some money, yeah?
Absolutely.
Terrific. Patrick, you could not be clearer, and thank you very much indeed for your call. Nigel, I was always taught that rules were there for the guidance of wise men and the obedience of fools. We should spend our money on our own territories before anyone else, says Jeremy in Richmond. Yes, Nigel, I agree with you. We should... we should be able to use our foreign aid budget to help our own people first. In fact, so far, France and the Netherlands can help their Caribbean islands because they're part of those countries, so it's not foreign aid. That's on Twitter. Technically, you're right. Technically, the French overseas territories have representatives in the French Parliament, the Assemblée Nationale, so they are considered to be, you're quite right, a part of France, whereas we have a slightly more hands-off approach, whether it's Gibraltar or the British Virgin Islands or wherever else. So I do take that legal point that was made on Twitter, and yet the European Union, which of course has no territorial hold over the Caribbean, was boasting in the European Parliament yesterday that they're going to give money to French and Dutch dependent territories. Oh, I didn't hear, by the way, a single penny being offered from the European Union to any British dependent territory. Funny that, isn't it? I wonder what Shahid in Hemel Hempstead makes of this.
Yeah, well, one big massive problem I've got with your stance is you failed to mention that all of these overseas territories are tax havens. They allow the Googles of this world and other massive companies to dodge paying taxes, the right amount of taxes in this country, and they just register themselves over there.
Right,
and
so...
if those islands choose not to, collect...
So, hang on. So, would you call Luxembourg a tax haven?
I don't know about Luxembourg, but I'm British.
Would you call Dublin a tax haven?
Sorry?
Would you call Dublin a tax haven?
Well, they've got a lower rate of... But don't try to dodge the point. If they choose not to collect...
No, Shahid, what I want to just get to the bottom of is this. The way that international law is structured, whether we like it or not, big companies choose to pay their corporation tax in different parts of the world very often because they take advantage of lower tax regimes. And Shahid, they do it legally, all right?
Luxembourg. We're not responsible for them two countries. The British government can take direct control of these overseas territories, and they should. They say no more allowing tax havens because this money should be coming to the British Treasury. And as for foreign aid, there's all sorts of... It's the smallest budget of all. The British government spends over 800 billion every single year. About 40 to 50 billion is borrowed, but the rest of it is raised through taxes. And there's easily enough war zones, enough starvation, enough people dying through the lack of clean water where that money can easily be spent. I strongly suspect that when they can't find the money to spend this, I strongly suspect there's people who've got stances like you who are opposed to foreign aid, who deliberately mess it up. They can easily spend that money in advance, plan it, give it to charities, and make sure that it can be spent wisely. Stop going on about this is a...
So let's be clear, Shahid. Let's be clear. You're quite happy in 2017 Britain for us to borrow the money that we give away in foreign aid, and you're quite relaxed about £35 million a day being given out all over the world in foreign aid, and you think it's a non-issue.
Well, no, if I have things like my way, that there'll be loads of affordable housing, and we wouldn't be wasting £25 billion on housing benefit.
But that is an entirely separate debate. And if we were discussing the UK budget, Shahid, and what our national priorities should and should not be, I would absolutely take that point. I would argue, even though there are bigger items of expenditure, there's an awful lot we could do with £35 million a day, and there's a feeling, Shahid, that it's being spent poorly, that it's being given to corrupt regimes, that the money is not reaching the right place, and the one time when a British dependent territory, and yes, it's got some wealthy business people in it, but the one time we actually want to help our own people, the government hasn't got the guts to say to the OECD, we're going to do our own thing.
Right, can I speak now? But you're waffling on a lot there.
No, Shahid, if you actually would have analysed this phone call, I've said very little. Now, you can make one quick point back, and then we're going to move on to somebody else.
No, you come off the point and you said loads. Right, first of all, we choose to waste $25 billion every single year on housing benefits.
No, right, Shahid. Sorry, I'm ruling you out. We're not discussing the broader points of the budget. When we do, you'll be welcome to call in, and you're a regular caller to the show, but we are discussing our foreign aid priorities here and why the British Prime Minister feels incapable of helping our own dependent territories. We've got a new caller, and he's a Nigel. He's from Westerham, apparently, in Kent. Good evening.
Hello, Nigel.
So you're a Nigel from Westerham.
I'm a Nigel from Westerham.
And I'm a Nigel from Westerham, so there we are.
I live in between Westerham and Sundridge, and I'm sure you can pinpoint me almost.
I know exactly where you are. I know every pub within walking distance of your house. Now, Nigel, tell me, that aside, tell me, how do you feel about the foreign aid budget as a whole?
First of all, Nigel, I'm going to criticise you, but I'm going to actually premise to say that I think you're the best thing that's happened in politics, and I love you. And what you've done for Brexit is just fantastic. I'm really a fan of yours, but I've got to take you to task.
Go on.
On the situation about whether or not we should help the British Virgin Islands.
Yeah, you've got, Nigel, you've got 60 seconds.
Right, okay.
In which, and by the way, no repetition, no hesitation. You've got 60 seconds to make your point.
Okay. Apparently, they pay no capital gains tax, no gift tax, no sale tax, no value-added tax, no profit tax, no inheritance tax or estate duty, and no corporation tax. Now, possibly, this country ought to recognise the fact that it's in a very, very accident-prone area as regards hurricanes, and maybe they ought to set aside a little bit more tax to compensate for the fact that they're likely to get serious damage over hurricanes.
OK. No, that's a fair point. These are islands that have some big amounts of money swilling through them, and they should perhaps have their own contingency fund to deal with these issues. I totally accept that point, but, and I accept that point, and I think you're absolutely right, but in terms of our own foreign aid budget, isn't it a bit weak and spineless of a British Prime Minister saying she can't help the poor people in these territories because of international rules?
Well, I think the country is sort of really responsible, for its own population. You see, I mean, I think we have different problems, and we have to charge tax, for the people that aren't quite so deserving or...
Well, there's always an argument for deserving and non-deserving. I'm going to say thank you to my namesake from the same postcode. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, exclusive in LBC. It's 7:30, and we have the biggest foreign aid budget of any Western world country, and yet, apparently, we can't use any of it to help our own dependent territories in the Caribbean who were so badly hurt by Hurricane Irma. And a lot of you feel very strongly about this on both sides of the argument. Randy says on Facebook, we can't stop foreign aid altogether. Have a heart. We have got a heart, Randy, for the poor people living in the British Virgin Islands and the other islands who've lost everything. John says, why do we have a budget deficit? Why do we have to borrow money to give it away in foreign aid? Well, John, it's a point I've raised many, many times before. Anne says we give far too much in foreign aid to a detriment of our own people who are desperate for help. So, strong opinions on both sides of this argument. But let me just pick up, if I can, quickly, on a report that has appeared in Scandinavia over the course of the last few months. And I have talked about Sweden before on this show, that something very disturbing is happening in Sweden, which, when I used to go there in the 90s on business, was, I think, the most settled, comfortable European country in the world, actually, that I've ever been to. Sweden has, proportionately, taken more of the migrants that have crossed the Mediterranean than any other country. There are massive problems of integration, and there is also a problem with crime. Now, I know that even speaking about this makes people very upset. But I'm going to say this, because I think it's very important, that a journalist, a Swedish journalist called Joachim Lamotte, was investigating the rape of a 12-year-old girl in Sweden and was told that police have not even interviewed the prime suspect 2 months later because authorities cannot cope with the sheer volume of cases since Sweden opened its borders to mass immigration 2 years ago. Lamotte says he contacted the authorities and was told that the case had not been acted upon because police simply cannot cope with the workload of having so many rape cases to investigate. Now, that report has appeared in the Swedish press. It's been picked up by one or two quite substantial US networks. And as with all of these things, you know, if somebody says a rape's occurred, well, it does need to be investigated and it does need to go through a legal process. But believe me, something very disturbing and worrying is happening in Sweden. Whether this case of itself is absolutely right, something is happening in cities like Malmö that has made them unrecognisable from what they were a few years before. And I think Mr. Juncker yesterday saying he's going to push on for a European Union and a common asylum policy, I think there are more political shocks to come. And that story, you know, we're looking for more news and more information, and I will keep you up to date on it. Now, foreign aid. Why can't we spend it on our own people? I think we should be able to. I wonder what Ali from Uxbridge thinks of that.
Hello, Nigel.
Good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. First-time caller, so just go easy on me, yeah?
I'll be very kind, Ali. I absolutely promise. Now, go on, say what you want to say.
I'm just going to say, because I was born and brought up in Pakistan, and we give, I think, over 500 to 600 million a year foreign aid to Pakistan.
Yep.
And believe me, over 95% doesn't reach to the needy people. All it goes into these corrupt politicians' pockets, you know. And, you know, the prime example is, recently, you know, one of the Prime Minister, Nawaz Sharif, I'm sure you know him.
Yep.
He has been just disqualified from the court, from the highest court, for corruption charges. And, you know, that's where he has most of his money. He's got about 7 apartments in Park Lane, over 100 properties all across UK. And before he became Prime Minister, like 20 years ago, he didn't have enough money to even, like, buy a house.
So Ali, you are as somebody that lived in Pakistan and saw foreign aid coming into the country, you are absolutely convinced that much of it is being taken off by the rich people and not going to the poor people.
Now, if you convert the local currency from the British pounds, it's like 130 or 140 to £1, yeah? And when you convert into 500 million a year, and when you see most of these rural areas, there are areas in Pakistan where they don't have enough roads to even have buses.
So what should we do, Ali? I mean, clearly, from what you're saying, David Cameron must be pretty daft if he thinks his greatest achievement is lining the pockets of rich people in poor countries. But what do you think we should do, Ali? Given, I mean, you obviously feel very strongly about this, and it's a very powerful phone call. Should we suspend foreign aid completely, or just distribute it on a different basis?
Or distribute it on different basis, or should start program yourself, where you can either you got to make sure that the money reaches to the poor people, or don't give it to it. Because what's the point giving it to it by just making yourself Mr. Good, and the money never reaches to the poor people? What is the point?
Ali, as a first-time caller, your phone call has made a very big impact on this debate and on this programme, and I thank you very much. Wow, what a powerful contribution. Nigel, what country do we not give money to? At this rate, we'll be sending money to other planets, says Yvonne from Telford. I quite like that. And on Twitter, Jim says, we still pay money into the EU. Where is the money from the EU for British territories? No, Jim, you don't get it. The money from the EU is going to the French colonies, or dependent territories, and the Dutch ones. The Brits get nothing. Again, some of us, I guess, might say. Nathaniel from Blackheath, we've got this large foreign aid budget compared to the rest of the world, contentious in the eyes of many, and yet we can't use it in the case of these British Caribbean islands. Is that right?
Okay, with the foreign aid budget, I agree with your last caller completely. That money needs to be followed.
Yep.
It needs to go to the right places completely. That needs to happen instantly. It's going to the wrong places, but it's also going to a lot of the right places.
Yep.
I think, as in we are the 5th biggest economy in the world, it is our responsibility to help others in need. That is basic human compassion that needs to happen. As in there's no problem with a foreign aid budget at all. Yes, I would 100% keep a foreign aid budget. It needs changing. That's the problem.
Nathaniel, I've been a critic of this. I've been a frontline political critic of what Cameron did on this, but I've never advocated getting rid of it, and I would agree with you. Some of it does go to the right places. The worry is too much of it doesn't.
Okay, I don't think there is too much of it doesn't. As in, if you actually I think that's a little bit of scaremongering. I think it's very easy to pick up quite a few little cases and make out that that's 75%. I don't believe in that.
Well, let me ask you, Nathaniel, do you think that any money should have been going to India over the course of the last 10 years or so?
Oh, 100%. As in India is a poor economy. Obviously, it's gone to the wrong places, as in there have been buying weapons and that kind of thing.
Well, they've got a space project, Nathaniel.
They do have a space project, and what a ridiculous thing. But that's not our duty to tell them how to govern their own country. We need to help the poor. We need to do that, and that's why I'm saying that money needs changing and going.
All right, okay. No. I'm hearing you through on this. So, following your logic, Nathaniel, should we be helping now, regardless of OECD rules that perhaps the Brits are overinterpreting, should we be helping the poor people in those Caribbean islands?
Okay, 100%. The thing is, we are sending them money. I think you're trying to make it a bit black and white to listeners, as in it's the kind of thing that we had the chance to send money and we said no.
Well, what we're sending, Nathaniel, I mean, let's be absolutely clear, let's be factual. The UK has pledged, so far, £57 million. So we are pledging some money, but actually, in the context of what's needed to rebuild things, it isn't really very much, is it?
Yeah, completely. But also the idea is, as in, like, with a foreign aid budget and everything like that, you're saying is, obviously, just change the law. The problem is obviously this is one of the first times that we've ever had to send the British Virgin Islands anything. And so there isn't legislation set up for that. But we are sending them money. They are going to receive money. And also, when there is wealth out there is huge amounts of wealth out there. There's a huge amount of tax avoidance. There's companies out there that can afford to, just rebuild their own island.
That point was made, Nathaniel, a few minutes ago from a caller from Westerham, that actually there was some big money sloshing through that economy, and if they kept a little bit of it back through a small tax for a sovereign wealth fund, they would actually have provisions to deal with these things. And I do agree. I do agree with that point. But as it is, Nathaniel, isn't it a bit weak-kneed and gutless of a British Prime Minister to say she's frustrated about this and yet shows no will to really do anything about it?
Oh, she's been weak-kneed and gutless since she was elected.
Right, so this is just the latest example, is it?
Oh, God, yeah. Well, just look at everything. I obviously don't support the Tories. I definitely don't support UKIP, but I definitely don't support the
Tories. Nathaniel, I've got to thank you for your call. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 7:45. The foreign aid budget has become an intensely political issue over the course of the last few years as David Cameron sought to make sure we spent 0.7% of our GDP every year on it, and we do. It's £13 billion a year. It's £35 million every single day. It is, by any measure, a very large sum of money. And there's argument about how it's spent and where it's spent. And yet, when Hurricane Irma wreaks its destruction and does so to British-dependent territories of Anguilla, Turks and Caicos and the British Virgin Islands, we find the British government is not allowed to use that foreign aid budget to send money because of international rules, and the Prime Minister says she is frustrated. So are you frustrated that we can't help our own people in this situation, or are you even more frustrated by the way that foreign aid itself is administered? Or perhaps you think, actually, we're proving that we're using this money to be a force for good. Matt says on Facebook, until you can convince the rich to be more compassionate and think less of their bank accounts, the countries in the world will not get better for the common person. Matt, that's fine if the foreign aid's being used to help people who need it and not being taken off in corruption and all the rest of it. Now, Barry is my next caller from Croydon, who I'm told has some experience of these islands. Barry, good evening.
How are you going, Nigel? Are you all right?
I'm very well indeed, thanks. So Barry, tell me, you've got some family links with these islands, I'm told.
I certainly have, and I'm coming from a personal interest here.
Yep.
Because my folks are from both islands, St. Martin and neighbouring Anguilla.
Okay.
Okay. Now, I do agree with the question that you posed. I think that our foreign aid budget needs to be rethink. And I will not go as far as to call the Prime Minister spineless and gutless.
Right.
But there is something wrong. There is something wrong. And I think that we should do away with the rules. This is a real emergency. And I must just let your listeners know that at the moment I have family who are surviving on canned foods because the fresh food is a bit hard to come by at the moment. At night, they've got no electricity and they are living by candles. And so it is very, very poor. And just one last thing. People knew that really after this like devastating tragedy hit, we all knew that St. Martin would get more money from the French and that Britain would just...
And Barry, just 1 second, I made the point earlier, I was in the European Parliament yesterday and the European Parliament President was saying we're giving money to St. Martin. So yes, absolutely, they will get money, no question about it.
And it is really disgusting because people really need to say, well, the UK government wants to have all of these islands, but they don't want to support them. And as you mentioned earlier, there is a sort of hands-off, a sort of a distance approach. But like
yes.
whereas St. Martin is more built up and it's got more investment and it is pretty poor. It is really poor, Nigel.
I mean, Barry, listen, I'm pleased that you've called because we get sort of direct experience with somebody telling us what it's like for those on the islands that aren't rich, and that's very important. And yes, I'm with you. I think Theresa May, either tear the blooming rules up and ignore them or introduce emergency legislation. It's not hard. But Barry, the other argument that's been made is that throughout these Caribbean islands, there are some fairly big companies operating and swishing through some big sums of money. Could perhaps a little bit more help come from some of them too?
Well, this is the wrong argument. You've had two callers ring up.
Yep.
When you have people put their money overseas, they look after their own personal interest. They are not going to look after the other 5,000, 10,000, 15,000 people on the island. I do hear that point,
yep.
But that is a different argument for a completely different time. That
okay.
is not the argument.
Barry, would you...
That's not the argument.
Barry, let me ask, and thank you for that. Barry, let me ask you, and you've got knowledge of what's going on there, is this a real emergency?
It is. You have the ferry, which takes you over from Blowing Point in Anguilla to St. Martin, out of action. And if you can see inside it, it looks like there's been a massive fight between some drunken yobs. It really is desperate. And I thank Boris Johnson for going down there. And he sounds as if he's fighting for us, but I think we need to stop being wishy-washy.
Yeah, no. Barry, listen, Barry, thank you for that call and some first-hand family insight into the situation down there. Barry, first-time caller, that's a very valuable call, and thank you. Why are the British not allowed to use EU funds to send to the overseas territory as the French and the Dutch can? Are there different rules? Yeah, Leslie, there are. We're British. It's quite simple. We never seem to be very good at winning at these things. No, Leslie, the point was made earlier. Certainly, I can't speak for the Dutch, but in the case of France, their dependent overseas territories are actually part of Greater France, and they send MPs to the Assemblée Nationale, and that's the real reason why. Why give money to a country when they can't spend their money in the right areas? Indians are in poverty, but space is cool, I guess. Yep, no, lots of those. We could have bought another invisible garden bridge with that 50 million, says George from Glasgow. And Dave is calling from Harold Wood. Good evening, Dave.
Good evening, Nigel. I want to thank you so much for being the stick that prods the hornet's nest, which is the EU. Thank you very much for that.
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, they do keep stinging me, Dave, but I'll keep on trying. Now, the foreign aid budget, I want to ask you two questions, Dave. One, as a whole, is it bloated and being badly spent? And two, should we be using some of it to help our own people in these islands?
Well, I think if we're proud to call one of these islands the British Virgin Islands,
yep,
I think we should support them. It's part of, I guess, our colony. Please excuse my history.
Well, actually, I mistakenly used the word colony earlier and corrected it very quickly to dependent territory. So that's the right place to be, Dave.
So there is an issue, of course, with tax avoidance and so on. But the trouble is, like we did with our banking here, if we're going to start penalising the banks, they will go abroad. So they must be spending money on whether people supporting their lifestyle out there. So there is a certain amount that needs to be relied on from the rich earners. But do you know what, Nigel? I'm almost ashamed to be an Englishman sometimes. And it's the EU flexing their muscles again, just showing us how weak we are.
We are. Do you know what, Dave? I rather agree with that. We're weak. Thank you. And my last caller this evening is Louise, who's calling from Shaftesbury in Dorset. Good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. How are you?
I'm well. Louise, we're running out of time, but you've got 60 seconds to tell me without hesitation or repetition how you feel on this issue.
The point I want to make is I think there's a lot of financial prejudice going on here, and I think May is being very weak and hiding behind excuses of what she can and what she can't do. I think she's politically covering her bottom, and I think that we ought to be, no matter what, sending money out there. There are poor people, that's irrelevant. It is our territory. We should be helping. If a hurricane hit an area of Scotland, if there was lots of wealthy there and poor, it would be irrelevant.
It would.
We would be,
yes.
We would be supporting and we would be doing whatever it took to rebuild infrastructure. And that should be exactly the same with these territories.
Do you know what? You didn't need 60 seconds, did you, to make that point and make it incredibly clearly. Louise from Shaftesbury, another first-time caller, thank you very much indeed for that call. And Louise really sums up in many ways how I feel about all of this. You know, I have had grave reservations about the Cameron policy on our foreign aid budget as a whole. I think we raised it to try and send a big virtue signal to the rest of the world. I'm certainly unconvinced it's been spent well in many areas. But here, when there's a clear case of poor people living in British dependent territories in need of help, and we're not actually doing anything about it, really, because the Prime Minister is frustrated over international rules. For goodness sake, show some leadership, do something, stand up for our own people, help them, and then say to all of them, do you know what, next time round you can have a seat in Parliament and become a fully integrated part of the United Kingdom. We are no longer ashamed of our dependent territories. We're going to start treating them properly. That's my view. You've been listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. I'm back on Sunday morning from 10. Coming up tonight from 10 o'clock, it's Ian Collins, but up next, it's Clive Bull.
Nigel, thank you. So lots to come between now and 10 at 9. It's the Property Hour, and expert Kate Faulkner will be here to talk about the housing market. She's got advice on buy-to-let and first-time buyers and landlord issues. That's all coming up in the Property Hour. We're going to be keeping a close eye on a developing situation with German fans at Arsenal's Emirates Stadium. We'll bring you more on that as it comes in. And we start with Jacob Rees-Mogg telling LBC that increased use of food banks is rather uplifting. So